compensation and also provide a staffing update. And then the third part will be in 2 weeks at your Finance Committee meeting on March 21st. And that will be what the actual budget development process looks like from the time the proposed budget is presented to the board to the time, through the time that the board has to approve a budget. And then once the county finishes their budget and the state finishes their budget, what that process looks like as well. But back to today, I'm just going to introduce it and flip it to Dr. Mutillo, who's going to do most of the presentation. I'll perhaps add some comments. But we're going to start by reviewing the actual compensation structure, recent changes of the last couple of years. We're going to take a look at staffing and in particular vacancy rates across various types of positions we've got in the district and do a year-over-year comparison. Share with you some background, high level of what our hiring process looks like in a district for different types of positions. And then share with you how we support our beginning teachers and alternate licensure teachers, and also give you some background on what our recruitment efforts look like. So pretty robust. We've got natural dividing points at each of these different sections, so we'll be glad to entertain questions as we go, or if you can, there'll be a natural break at each one of these sections.
And real quick, Mr. Nieder, for you and Dr. Mutillo, because this table is a little bit longer than the prior one that was in here, if you're on the end like I am, you gotta just project a little more so that the microphones can pick up.
Okay.
Yep.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you for the reminder. And one additional thought I'll share with you before handing it off to Dr. Mutillo. Just as you heard when we did our budget 101 a couple weeks ago, that our budget and how we can use our funds is highly structured and guided. And while we do have some flexibility in making decisions, much of what we can or can't do with different funds is set by the state or even the federal government. Similarly, as it relates to compensation, the state and state legislature has the primary responsibility for setting the structure around that. And while we do have some local flexibility, it's limited, and you'll hear more about that. So I just want to sort of set the context for that.
If I may, just real quick, would like to introduce my team that's with me. I've learned y'all ask some good detailed questions, so in case they can better provide some detailed answers, I've invited Darren Levine from the left. He's our Director of Data and Reporting, and not in his official title, but salary projection. So he's been really busy the last couple of years. And then Terrence McCotter, who's our Senior Director for Salary and Information Systems. Sally Reynolds, who is our Senior Director for Talent Acquisition. Jason Kennedy, who is our District Director of Recruiting for the district. And then Myra Zetto, who's our Senior Administrator in Talent Management and does a lot with support for our teachers and beginning teachers. So thanks to this team for being here as well. So we'll go ahead and get started with some compensation terms. We've already talked a bit about compensation, but I don't know we've really defined and laid out the terms that we use in a lot of our presentations and conversations. So I wanted to outline that for you. Really starting with salary schedules. They're posted on our public-facing website, so they're very transparent as to where they are. And they outline hourly, monthly, and annual pay for all of our employee groups. And then these schedules will reflect both salary grades and steps. So you can see the next one in there, salary grades. And that really refers to a range of grades 17 through 30 and includes most of our non-certified staff. So for example, you would find bus safety assistants on that grade 17, and then on grade 30, you would find staff like master mechanics, various technical specialists for our boilers, chillers, and those kinds of positions. We have nearly 200 position groups on those graded bands, 17 through 30. And then on the other hand, we have salary steps. So those are the incremental levels of experience that are within a grade. So in and that's usually steps 0 through 32 plus. So when you look at grade 17, for example, somebody would start at 0 years of experience on step 0 and then move all the way to step 32 plus on those scales. It's also important to note that the state determines each year whether to advance those steps. Generally they do, so we take that for granted, but there have been periods of time where the state doesn't move non-certified, certified, all employees to their next step, and they stay stagnant. So that is something that we do monitor each year. And these salary schedules, they're really a starting point. That's another, I think, important point to make for employees, where when you're hired, you can find yourself on a scale, somewhere on a grade, somewhere on a step generally. But when you move to next year, rarely does your salary actually mirror that scale, because there could be increases by both the state and local increases that we do. And as I've referenced before, it's not always guaranteed that the step moves. So it really is, those scales and schedules are the starting place. It gives employees where they might go in the future, but that always changes with different increases and decisions made at the state level. Also, we have salary bands, and these are generally our administrative bands, senior administrators, directors, senior directors, technology bands, and they go on a range as well for each of those. So they don't have steps, and generally they see increases when we have like a % increase to all employees. That's how they might see increases. I want to talk also about salary compression. I think you've heard that term. That term means different things to different people, I think. So I wanted to kind of just explain how we use that term. So when you have you can have horizontal compression, for example, where you look at the difference between grades across the band. And you can also have sort of vertical compression, where you look at, are there differences between each of the steps on the scale? And some of our recent adjustments, for example, have made sure that our grades 17 through 30 have a 25-cent differential as you move. They were not always like that. There were periods of time where if you might move from 1 year of experience to the next, you'd see a very small or a no increase, or you'd see very different kinds of increases. So our move to create those salary bands at, within the years of experience, that helped sort of take care of some of that vertical compression. But then there's also the horizontal compression, and while we have, differentials between each of the grades, some of our increases have been so significant for our lower paid employees, which has been a good thing. Some of our higher sort of folks on the bands, like 28, 29, 30, have seen lower % increases. So that kind of creates some horizontal compression. And we knew that going in. Our priority has been to make sure that we take care of our lowest paid employees first. But we'll continue to monitor horizontal compression, I think, in different budget cycles and compensation increases as we move forward. And then also want to talk about our certified staff a bit. You can see they have really two parts of their pay. You have a state base, which again, the state designates what that is. And then you also have a local supplement. And that's a supplement that we use local funds to increase or enhance the state pay that our employees, certified employees, receive.
Dr. Mutillo, can you talk about the difference between certified and non-certified staff, since we're just going over terms?
Yeah, sure. So certified staff are generally those staff who require licenses. So there's your teachers, principals, but sometimes we talk about them separately. But essentially it's your teachers and certified instructional support, like your social workers, your speech language pathologists, counselors, those kinds of folks. And then we kind of use some terms interchangeably because neither of them are perfect. We have non-certified and classified. So we kind of use the non-certified and classified interchangeably sometimes, but those are folks generally who don't require by the state a license, even though many of our non-certified folks might have a license. A lot of our folks on the senior, the admin bands, they may have licenses, teaching licenses, but that's not how they're paid and identified by the state. Does that help?
Yes. Thank you. Are there any questions on terms from board members?
I could maybe just add one more thing to perhaps add a little more clarity. So you've got all the teachers and instructional support staff. They're certified. You've got the classified staff. They're non-certified. And within the classified staff, AJ went through, we've got individuals that are on grades 17 through 30. Everything from front office support staff in the schools, bus drivers, custodial, child nutrition workers, all the way up. They are generally non-exempt employees. They're subject to the Fair Labor Standards Act. And then we've got banded classified employees, 2 bands, technology bands and administrator bands, admin, senior director, senior director. So kind of those 2 groups, and then school administrators.
So Mr. Nader talked a little bit earlier on about compensation changes and who determines those changes. For certified and non-certified employees both, it is generally state lawmakers will approve compensation increases as part of the state budget. With an increase that's included in the state budget, they provide funding for state-funded employees. But locally, we then have a cost to cover any of those increases for our locally funded employees. I think you've heard from Ms. Kimsey last session. We have employees that are both state-funded and locally funded, and we treat them the same because they're in the same position group. So that often causes an increase for us. Also, many years, the state has not approved a budget until well after our fiscal year has begun. It was pretty close last year. I think it was in mid-July, so that was pretty close to our July 1 fiscal start. But generally during the long session, they don't always approve it by July 1. So we have to wait on those state budget decisions before we often move forward with our compensation increases that might be included in the board's budget. And I'll talk a little bit more about some ways we've deviated from that recently just to get some increases out to our employees as quickly as we could. And then I want to talk a little bit about employee groups. First, we have our certified employees, and again, those are our teachers, our assistant principals, like we talked about, instructional support staff, and they are paid on the state salary schedule with a local supplement. And then our assistant principals, they are tied to our teacher pay, and they receive 19% more than the teacher A schedule. So that's an important thing to note about how assistant principal pay is determined by the state. And then the next group I want to talk about is principals. They're paid on a state salary schedule using local funds to maintain some predictability and stability for them. And I want to talk a little bit. This gets a bit complicated, but I think it's important for us to understand as a group how those salaries are determined. So the state, there is a state pay scale that varies depending upon whether a school meets growth, exceeds growth, or doesn't meet growth at all. The state schedule also includes some variation for school size, but it does not include any steps for experience. So we ensure that we take the money that the state does give us for principal salaries. We ensure that our principals make at least as much as they would on that pay scale, and generally they're making more, but we create a scale that gives them predictability and stability. So we build a scale that also takes into account school size, but it also takes into account years of experience so that there are incremental steps. If we stuck with just the state scale, you could see, for example, if a school moved from exceeded growth down to net growth, that would be a more than $8,000 pay cut for the principal. If it happened to drop from exceeded and didn't meet growth, that would be a $16,000 pay cut. And we don't have any other employee group that has that kind of variability and unpredictability in their schedules. I think that was a decision before I started in this role, but that a prior board made to make sure we provide that stability for our principals.
You may see that referred to as a hold harmless for principals as well. I think that was the terminology used at the time.
And every time the state changes the salary schedule, we go back and we look at those salaries to make sure they're getting paid at least, and we shift funding as needed to keep that overall principal salary increase. We'll talk next about our classified employees again, IA, CNS cashiers, bus drivers, lead secretary. These are folks that, as we've said, have been paid on the grades 17 to 30 mostly. It also includes our occupational therapists and physical therapists. These employees are a little bit different because they're not considered certified by the state, even though they are licensed by the North Carolina Board of Occupational Therapy and Physical Therapy. So it's a group we have to look at differently at times because of that uniqueness. Last group is our banded employees. Again, these are our admin through senior directors, also includes technology bands. And we do kind of keep SLT the same with this group, but they're technically not on one of those 4 bands. They are handled through contracts. And, but generally when we look at a percent increase, those SLT positions generally mirror that. So next I want to go into some starting salaries. This is just sort of a history back from 07, 08 on a couple particular groups. It wouldn't be possible to go through every group. These are some of the groups that have kind of been in the conversation over the past couple of years, and I just thought it might be helpful for you to take a look at those. It highlights teachers, instructional assistants, bus drivers, and elementary principals, just as an example of the principal group. And you can see at the bottom of that slide, there's a percent increase over that 16-year period. So if you look at for teachers, for example, that a 16% increase, over that time, it's about a 2% increase each year, and that's not kept up with inflation. You can see the inflation percentage there. And then in recent years, we have accelerated some of that pay. You can see sort of towards those last few rows that you've seen some increases there, to the point that this slide shows where we may have outpaced inflation a bit, but I'm not going to sit here and say that $30,000 annually is enough for any employee. So we still have work to do regardless of the relationship to inflation over the past couple of years.
And if I could maybe just add some historical context before we go on to the next slide. Pre-Great Recession, maybe going back to about 2000, the legislature was pretty consistent in year-over-year compensation increases being legislated for all categories of staff. And it varied from year to year, but reasonable increases that were keeping up with inflation. 2, 3, 4, 5%, I think, even in one year. The Great Recession hit in 2008. Obviously, the entire economy of the country went into a tailspin. State revenues dropped. Local revenues dropped, so that the state's capacity to be able to fund year-over-year
He's going to be here reading.
was really hampered. So there was not, I don't think there were any state legislative increases during the first few years of the Great Recession. But a recovery took place, and the economy started back up, and the legislature was inconsistent, and in many years there were no increases, or there were increases for certified staff but not support staff. And we don't have a slide of the history, but at another point we would like to show you the history, and maybe when we get to the budget, give you a sense. And then more recently in the last few years, and you'll see this in the next few slides, the superintendent, staff, and the board worked together to make some local decisions because we weren't keeping up and we had issues. And even though you can see, a look at the IA schedule going back to 2007-08, that's $16,700. It's about $8 an hour effectively for somebody working full time. And now you can see it's up to $29,000, but if you look year over year, it didn't get really boosted up till just the last few years, and that was not the state legislating an increase. That was the district going from, I think the lowest at the time, $11.80 an hour, going up to 13, and then 15, and our current minimum hourly rate is 16. Now, the state finally came along and got to 13 and then 15. but we're still above 560. So
I just need to make one point about the teacher column. So as David has already mentioned, when you see after 08-09, you see the impact of the Great Recession where there was not a raise for teachers for a number of years in a row. I want to move you to 2015-16, where it looks like there was a nice raise between 14-15 and 15-16. That is the year that the legislature eliminated longevity pay for teachers and rolled longevity pay into their salaries. Took the longevity pay away and rolled it into salaries. That is not additional money from the state. That is state money that was repurposed from one category where only teachers 10 years and above received longevity pay to now spread across all 30 years of teachers and call it a raise. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent Moore.
Next, I want to take a look at, this is our current teacher's salary schedule, and it is for our, you can see our bachelor's, what we call A license, not national board. We don't have one teacher salary schedule. We have multiple schedules that reflect, a teacher who just has a bachelor's, for a teacher who may be paid on a master's as well, and then you layer national boards on top of that, which generates additional scales, and then you have the special ed differential, which generates more scales. So this is just one example of many scales that we do have for our teachers. A few things to highlight here. You can see that these scales reflect the state base, again, with that local supplement. And really I generally say our local supplement makes up about 15% of a teacher's salary. When I did the range for this presentation, it's really 14 to 19%, depending on where you are on this particular scale. So I think 15 is still a pretty good generalization for it. And then you can also see highlight in yellow and orange the places where teachers don't see state increases. So these are just stagnations in the schedule where a teacher would not see an increase with their years of experience. Our local supplement helps them see somewhat of an increase annually. So you can see that reflected where you look at their total salary. It will increase every year, but that is because of the board's local supplement that makes that happen. And then wanted to talk to you about substitute teacher compensation increases. We have non-certified subs. Those are subs that don't have teaching degrees. We have certified subs, those who do have teaching degrees. And then we have instructional assistants as substitutes. Those are instructional assistants who are employed by us but fill in for a gap in a classroom for a substitute position. So you can see just take the certified and the non-certified together, that there have been really no increases over a period of time until very recently, where we moved the certified pay from 103 up to 130, and then the non-certified, which was at 80 for a while, to 115. Some of the board members who have been here may remember we did a slight increase for non-certified, and then went to that 115 after a few months. So that was just wrapped into a lot of our different compensation recommendations at the time. So the IA sub, and we've heard a little bit about the concerns I think you all have as well from some of our IAs, especially our veteran IAs. What you see here is that instructional assistant as a substitute rate is a state-determined, state-identified rate based on the A00 teacher scale. So if that A00 teacher scale stays the same, this rate stays the same, and it only increases as that state scale increases. So you can see over the past couple of years there have been some small increases to it. Our IAs have been one of the employee groups who've received the most significant percent increases in our district. So our local increases for IAs have outpaced that IA as substitute. So some of our more veteran IAs would actually take a pay cut based on that rate. So we ensure we use local funds to make sure they at least don't see a decrease in their pay. And we have some ideas that we will ultimately bring to you as part of next budget conversations to potentially correct the sort of manual hold harmless that we're using now. When I look back at this slide on November 2nd, I was sort of preparing this, I thought it was a misprint because I couldn't believe it was just November 2nd of 2021 that we started all of these series of increases, but it really was just over a couple of years ago. So these next few slides really take you through what the board approved in conjunction with the state legislature over the past just couple of years, because there have been some significant increases, and I feel like it'd be helpful to see that. So if you remember, November 2nd, the board made a decision to move non-certified employees to that 13 an hour minimum rate. As we've referenced, it was $11 something prior to that. So we made that decision to move all of our employees who were below 13 an hour up to 13 an hour. Another good example of compression there, because regardless of where you fell below that 13, we moved everybody up to 13 an hour. And then we also made a decision at that time to do a 1% increase to the local supplement. And we were waiting for the state to approve their budget at this time, so we wanted to do something for our employees. But we couldn't do everything we wanted to because we were waiting on the board or the state, to make a decision. So, yeah, I think that covers that slide. And that move to 13 an hour did impact 1,600 employees. I went back and took a look at that. So then this next slide here, again, this was December 7th, so a month later, but also retro back to July 1. So this is where we approved that second round of changes. At this time, there was a state legislated pay for certified employees. That was a 1.3% increase to the scale, but employees saw an average of 2.5% increase with their next step. So that was the state. Essentially, they moved the A00 up to $35.46 a month. And then we did a local percent increase of an additional 1.5% on the 1% that we gave. So a total of 2.5% increase to the local supplement. So that basically teachers saw a 2.5% increase in most cases on their overall salary. And then principals received a 2.5% state legislated increase. And I've already explained the principal scale and how we do that. So we ensured that they saw a 2.5% increase on the Wake County scale for them. And then non-certified employees, they received, the state did the 13 an hour, which we had already done at that point, and then we did the additional 0.5% increase. So the employees received a greater of 3% or 13 an hour. And then we also moved OTPT to this scale so that we could, to a new scale, so that we could give them the 3% increase as well. So that was, and then all of our other employees, the graded bands, received the 3% also. I think that includes that slide. All right, so the next one, this is that same meeting, December 7th, but these changes were implemented January 1 moving forward. So it was a second round of compensation changes, and so for certified employees, there were really no changes to state base salaries or the local supplement. The state steps remained in place because we rolled them in December, so they just continued. And then there was an additional state legislated $350 a month supplement for psychologists, speech language pathologists, and audiologists, while an additional $100 a month was provided to school counselors. So I think you've heard some about those state bonus, and some employees got varying amounts, and some employee groups didn't get any at all. So that was that's something we continue to hear our employees talk about. No additional changes to the principal schedule at that time, and this is where for non-certified, while the state went to 13 an hour, the board decided and approved a 15 an hour or 3% minimum. And then that's where we also instituted steps where we made sure that the grades 17 through 30 were 40-cent differentials, and then the experience step within were 25-cent differentials. And then bus drivers and IAs were moved to grade 20. Bus drivers had always been sort of on their, not always, but at one point had moved to a separate schedule, and we aligned them to grade 20. IAs had been at a grade 18, and when we looked at their job responsibilities along with the training and education that they had to get to be highly qualified, we felt like grade 20 was an appropriate classification for both groups, and they both received increases as a result of that. And then team leads, the special ed IAs, we moved to grade 21. This was our first sort of differential for special ed IAs. We had never had that before, but looking at the responsibilities of the special ed IAs, looking at some of the vacancy rates, we determined that a differential there was appropriate. It's a small differential, just one grade, but it is a start at acknowledging all that they go through and all that they do to support our students. Slide 13. Okay. And then this is the most recent round of changes. That brings us to this fiscal year and salaries that we now have in place. So we approved, board approved that August of 2022. And again, I mentioned earlier that the state had passed a budget by that time, so we were able to move forward with some things. So the state passed the 2.5% increase to certified employees, so a 4% average increase in state pay with the step, and then the state base for teacher, A00 moved to $3,700 monthly, and then the board approved a 4% increase to the local supplement. We'll say that every time we talk about a local supplement increase, it's generally, it had been 1.3, 1.4 million. I think next year, if we look at it, it'll be 1.6 million. So I think it's an important context that every time we talk about just 1% increase to a supplement that's only 15 to 20% of the teacher's salary, it costs about $1.6 million to do that. So it's an example of where our volume and our number of employees make even small increases challenging at times. And also on this slide, for our non-certified employees, the state has now gone to 15 an hour. The board approved an increase for Wake County employees to 16 an hour, and we maintained and a minimum of 4%. So you either went to the 16 or 4%, whichever was greater, and then the 40 cents per grade and the 25 cents step differential. And then our banded employees also received the 4.5% increase across the bands, or for the employees, but then we've increased those bands by 2%. We have our 4 different admin bands. It goes from administrator, senior administrator, director, senior director, and they have a minimum and a maximum. And we hadn't touched those minimums and maximums in a number of years. And while employees move based on their percent increases, not moving those bands hinders our opportunity to bring and hire new talent into the district. So it's important that each year, while they may not move as much as employee salaries do, we do move those starting bands to make us competitive in our recruitment of new employees.
And one, excuse me, a little more context, historical context, before Dr. Matilla goes on these hourly rates, where in recent years we've seen significant movement from $11.80 now up to a minimum of $16. And the state has also shown for public school system employees significant movement over the last few years. And the Wake County Board of Public WCPSS has been more aggressive. Currently, the state minimum hourly rate for LEAs is 15. We are at 16. But the context, back in 2018-19, I believe, pre-pandemic, the state approved a minimum hourly rate for all state employees of $15 an hour, except for employees of public school systems. And there was, I think, 1 or 2 other carve-outs. I think community college staff were carved out, possibly the universities. And they maintained that $15 an hour minimum for state employees, not public school system, community college, and university employees. And then the state finally went to $13 an hour minimum last year for public school employees and $15 an hour in the current year for public school system employees. There was no explanation of why public school system employees were carved out or university. And we found ourselves with another recruitment and retention challenge. Most of these are support staff, non-teaching staff that fall into the lower rates. So if we had a custodian or a skilled crafts person that was earning less than $15 an hour, they could take a lateral move, take their years of service and their pension, their state pension with them, take a state job doing something similar and get an instant pay increase. So we're on the other side of that now, but just context.
So I want to talk a little bit about bonuses briefly. Since November of 2021, the board has approved and we've paid out multiple employee bonuses, mostly with ESSER funds, but also some additional funds, including local funds. And they've been an important part of our compensation, I think, over the past couple of years. And, they just absolutely acknowledge the pandemic and the often heroic efforts that our employees went through to teach students, to support operations, to support families. So they definitely, acknowledge that, and were with one-time funds that were available, I think was an appropriate use that the board has determined, and staff also supported. But they're not a sustainable way to increase compensation. So we're always looking more towards salary increases, which are, carry year to year, count toward retirement. So that's a more real sustainable way to increase compensation. But when there are one-time funds available, that could be, bonuses are an appropriate use of that. So you can see there some of the different bonuses that we've paid out, up to $5,000 on the recruitment or the recognition and retention. CNS employees had $1,350 for all full-time CNS employees in May 2022. These in particular were federal funds that were earmarked only for CNS bonuses, which is why one of the reasons you see them kind of separated out from the other employees. We have the letters bonus that acknowledges not just professional learning, but professional learning that goes above and beyond the general time requirements and mastery of content that other PD would require. And then you can see some of the hiring bonuses that we've paid out to special ed teachers as well as IAs there also. So I'm going to cover that for you. So I know you can't read this slide very well, but I wanted to, at least if you blow it up on your laptop, you can probably see it. So this is looking at some of our current teacher scales. And I referenced before, we have lots of different teacher scales. So the ones that you see here, we have the bachelor's degree only, we have the master's degree only scale, we have the bachelor's and the national board, and the master's and the national board scale. And you can look across and see the difference in pay in some of those. And, oftentimes it's significant. Teachers who get paid on their masters see a 10% increase to their salary, for example. And the impact on that, if we look at somebody like at a step 3, if you have a high achiever who can be a beginning teacher and get their master's by year 3, then they would see a monthly increase of $490.97. It's fairly significant. If we carry that out a little bit further for that same teacher on step 3, and they then go to get their national board certification, you can see the difference from just a bachelor's is over $1,000 a month. So these are some significant ways that by earning a master's, being paid on that master's, and also earning national boards, that teachers can increase salary and compensation. And the vast majority of our teachers, 6,000 of them, over 6,000 of them, are paid on just that bachelor scale. If you remember, there is a state law now in place that if you didn't finish a course, it's by August 1, 2013, correct me if I'm wrong, team, I got it, that you don't get paid for that master's. So there's not as much incentive for teachers to go back and get it at this time. And so we'll be, we're kind of looking at that, and that could be a part of budget recommendations, and we're also looking at, potentially even earlier coming back to you. We're working on some proposals for that and may be able to bring it as early as, next work session to start talking about what might it look like to pay masters at a local level.
And just one more thing on the masters before you go on, Dr. Matillo. You've heard at recent board meetings during public comment, I think some social workers come in and speak to the master's pay issue. And that's what Dr. Matillo was referring to back in, 2013, when the legislature said, okay, you already had a master's degree, you'll continue to get that 10% differential, but after this point, you can get a master's degree, but you're still going to be on the regular schedule. So you've got, and it applies to social workers, teachers, it's all instructional staff, not just social workers, with similar years of experience. This one's making 10% more than this one just because of when they got their master's degree. And that's what Dr. Matillo said are going to likely bring a proposal to the board for consideration to address. But again, I want to re-emphasize, it's all instructional and instructional support staff, including social workers.
So since there's just a natural break here, if there are any salary or compensation specific questions, because we still have vacancy reporting, hiring practices, recruitment, and new teacher support, just anything that someone has on their mind regarding salary, compensation, so you're not having to wait till the very, very end. Dr. Ng, and then Ms. Edmonds.
I may have missed this, but just the historical explanation, looking back at the bus drivers, the chart for the bus drivers, that there was a decrease 2009, 2010. I see that there, in other, also the principal elementary school, there was a decrease at some point, and then they went back up. And what was the explanation for those?
Yeah, we did provide one, but a great question. So there was a point in time at which, and remember, this is just step 0. So there was a point in time at which the state legislature basically held pay the same. They advanced the steps, but held pay the same. So what that in turn then did was, for our step 0, cause that to be less, because our employees the rest of our employees didn't see an increase. So it really impacted that starting pay. So that was a brief period of time where they did that for a couple of years.
And that, timing-wise, was just as the Great Recession was coming on.
Yeah. So no employee saw a decrease in pay, but that decision by the state caused our salary scales to become lower, so that a new employee would make less that particular year than they would have the prior year. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Ms. Edmonds?
Back to slide 9. So, and you don't have to answer this today, but can you tell us at some point how we compare with our substitute pay, especially the instructional assistant as subs pay? For example, I think North Carolina is 38th in the country in teacher salary.
Right.
That kind of analysis, can
Yeah.
you get that to us at some point?
Yeah, I don't know that I'll get national sort of sub-rate pays, but
Or
we can. Yeah,
neighboring area, whatever.
We can look at it.
Some kind of comparison.
Yeah.
And then my other question, same slide 9, can you please repeat what you said about the hold harmless provision?
So that's referring to the instructional assistant as sub-rate, so that third row there. That is based on, it's a state identified rate based on the A00 teacher scale. So where you see increases in that rate, that's because the teacher scale increased. So, but as a district, we've increased IA pay so significantly in the past couple of years, they've outpaced those increases. So if we just kept those rates, then our IAs who jump into substituting classrooms our veteran IAs would see a decrease in pay. So we made sure that they at least don't see the decrease for the time being. And we are working on proposals to bring back to you as a board to see if we can have a more permanent solution where we can ensure that all IAs receive an increase when they serve as a substitute in a classroom.
Thank you.
Ms. Waters?
I have a question and a comment first. Just being out on school visits and interacting with staff, I know there's a great deal of appreciation for the bonuses that have gone out. Particularly remember comments coming from CNS staff, so appreciate the work that has gone into this. With regard to other bonuses, is there also an attendance bonus that has been offered? Can you speak to that, particularly as it relates to bus drivers, I believe?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you speak to?
I can speak a little to that because transportation handles that mostly, but there is an attendance bonus where bus drivers can miss a certain period of time, a certain number of days, and as long as that doesn't exceed a number, and I think it's a pretty small number, it might be 3 or 4, they can receive 2 $500 attendance bonus. So they're paid twice a year with different ranges. So we can get you more information on that, and we also are looking at, is that a way for us to potentially look at that attendance bonus and maybe look at additional, make that amount larger, look at that structure to help support not only bus driver recruitment and retention, but also bus driver attendance. So that is one of those things. Also, we're targeting a recent future board meeting to potentially bring you some recommendations on increasing that attendance bonus.
And as you are considering the attendance bonus, I would like to bring the safety assistance consideration into that conversation, because I know there has been some advocacy and some conversation around how we determine who receives those bonuses. And so if there could be some consideration or discussion around including safety assistance in that attendance bonus, I think that would be appreciated.
Absolutely. I think perhaps as early as 2 weeks from now at your next board work session, you may hear from us. And what we've been talking about would include the safety assistance as well as the drivers in another category as well of transportation.
I've got Ms. Caulfield and Mr. Swanson and Vice Chair Haggerty.
So where you were talking about the grades, do you have I understand the salary scales. Is there a chart, or did I miss it, that we could see what the entire picture is, what that looks like? Because it says, that there's some of the salaries range from 17 to 30. Is there just a whole chart? I can see what that whole thing looks like.
Yeah,
We don't have it in the slide deck.
It's
But-
linked on slide 4.
Yeah, if you click on that, and then, again, we don't have it in the deck, but if the board is desirous, we'll come back in 2 weeks. For the third part, we could walk through and spend a little time on that.
And if you search for it on Google, you can find it, and then they have the link. But it's a pretty big document.
It is linked on slide 4.
Yes.
and Ms. Caulfield, if you scroll down to the bottom of each of those scales, you can see the employee groups that are paid on each of those grades.
Would it be helpful, sorry, as Finance Chair, if Ms. Caulfield has specific questions, because it is a lengthy document. So I do
I'm
think
just
it's
trying to
helpful for.
understand what it looks like as a whole.
Okay, I want to make sure that if you have specific questions, that we do bring those back, that we just don't leave it to you to find.
Yeah. Thank you.
Like, here's your answer. Boom.
Right. Exactly. Because it's a big thing. Ms. Caulfield, did you have another question?
As far as the salary go, and I don't know, I might be jumping ahead, or if you're not, if this is something to talk about here, but one of the things I have heard a lot is that the teachers have to pay for their own supplies. Is there a certain part of their salary? Did they get, we were talking about bonuses where they got something? Is there something that would compensate them for supplies? Can they talk about that?
So I think what I would say generally is every school gets a certain amount of dollars per student for supplies. It's a bulk amount that goes to the school. Is it around $70 per kid?
Yeah.
60 something?
Between 60 and 70.
Between $60 and $70 per student goes to the school for supplies. Now, the school uses those funds in a variety of ways. The principal and the leadership usually at the school figure out, how much is for paper or copier contracts or supplemental textbooks or pens or sticky notes, all of those kinds of things. And each school has their own process for teachers to request supplies. So each school teacher should have a process at their school for how to request supplies. I would say that it is unlikely that the amount that is provided through DPI and the legislature per student is sufficient to meet the needs of all classroom teachers. So that's where you find things like PTAs that kick in funds to help support teacher supply drives or other ways that, because it's just probably not enough. What the state is providing is not enough. Teachers do I think teachers in the state of North Carolina get some sort of a tax write-off at the end of every year for,
Yeah, they just
It does not
increased
cover.
it to $500.
It's the last 3 years. It's not enough. Just trust me.
no, I'm just saying all the places. I'm just saying that clearly there is a tension on the fact that teachers have to pay for supplies such that there's a tax incentive on it, or not incentive, I guess there's a write-off on it on your taxes. There are people pitching in like PTAs and Wake Education Partnership, the Tools for Schools location where teachers can come shop once a quarter and receive basically 100 credits in supplies that are in the store there for free. So everybody recognizes this is an issue. But I think the first place that a teacher would start is what the process is at the school for disbursement of the dollars that are designated at the school for supplies, and then what other supports are in place. I think the Tools for School is a really good one. Something around 30 to 40% of our teachers had access Tools for Schools based on the most recent report that was brought to us. So there are a lot of teachers out there, and we do send periodic reminders to teachers to say, get on a list, make an appointment, you can go shopping. But I don't know that is enough to cover all of it. So I think that it is a certainly valid consideration. I think that is something that we should have some advocacy around.
Yes.
Because some PTAs are not
Correct.
as involved.
Yes.
Correct.
Yes.
And sometimes they're the ones who need the supplies.
This Kinsey, were you able to find?
Yeah, the base allotment to our schools for their general supplies and to pay for other things is $65 per student. The state puts forward $30 of that each year. In addition, we have differentiated formulas that go to our schools. Our middle and high schools will receive some dollars for athletics. A lot of our schools receive funds for science materials for those classes. Our magnet schools may get specific allotments based on their theme. Our early colleges may receive allotments based on that. So there is differentiation, but every school gets $65 per student.
And of that 65, over half of that, under half of that is funded by the state.
And as a final point of clarification, the state allotment per student used to be like $70 or $80 per student. They have reduced the amount they give for supplies at the state level from the 70 or 80 that it was about 10 years ago or more to now 30. And we have picked up some of the difference in that by allotting the other 35.
And that reduction
With local
took
dollars.
place during the Great Recession.
They just
But on the other
never brought
side of the Great Recession, we've had the most
Yeah.
robust economy I've ever seen in my lifetime. But
They never
they
restored that
never
reduction.
restored it.
There's a long history there, and we all know and agree that it's not enough, and everybody needs to do a little bit more. But I just want to make sure, Ms. Caulfield, that you've gotten all of your questions asked. Okay. Next up is Mr. Swanson, and then Mr. Haggerty.
Thank you, and thank you all for laying this out. I do think we have a lot of work to do, and I hope our friends at the General Assembly are paying attention as they're going through their budget to increase the salaries of our teachers, because we know that every profession possible is based on educators investing in students. And I think it's past time that they did what's best. So I just wanted to circle back to the point that Ms. Waters had raised regarding our safety assistants. I know that is a group that's often left out of the equation, so I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what's going to be presented to us as we realize that those transportation workers, those safety assistants, are the first groups that our students see, and the last group that they see going home. So I do think that showing, I know there's not enough funds for us to just bless everyone with the same amount, which I wish we could, but really paying attention to those groups that often are neglected from the conversation. My other point, I guess that was a statement rather, but my other question is, based on this teacher merit conversation that's being, and I know I'm not expecting you all to have all the answers, but how do you think that's going to affect our teachers, their salaries, and depending on what that criteria is going to look like? Because I think it's still an interesting concept what DPI is working with. Do we know, have you seen more data around that?
So, we've been looking at it for over a year. They've modified it a few times based on some feedback that has been provided. There have been opportunities for feedback for educators to provide, and administrators and superintendents. It will, for the vast majority of our teachers, increase compensation from where it is now, if it is funded. Proposing the pathways document without the funding, the pathways document right now is an idea. It's a proposal. It has no funding. And if it's not funded, and you still have the pathways, that's going to be, I think, very problematic, and there'll be a lot of negative feedback on that from our educators. But the initial pieces of that, most of our teachers would see a significant increase in pay at the beginning levels. I think what happens with the pathways is it becomes a little bit, the pathway towards additional increases in compensation then become much more limited, so that at the top end of the pathways, that pathways document does not include that high level of compensation for all teachers in the school, but for a few. And so I think that is something else that you have seen some feedback about, is how does the new pathways that are being proposed provide not just increases at the beginning for all teachers, but throughout the course of their career, with opportunities for all teachers to reach the higher levels of compensation that are proposed within the pathways. That is not as clear right now. And so I think that's where there's some questions. But the bottom line is, I think unless it is accepted by the General Assembly as the way to revise teacher compensation and funded by the General Assembly, I'm not sure if those questions, there's a lot of ifs right now.
Thank you. Great question in this legislative environment right now. Mr. Haggerty.
Thank you. Gentlemen, I really appreciate the presentation. You've covered a lot with it. I know there's a lot more to cover. And so I just want to see if we can place a bookmark to be able to come back and maybe, Madam Chair, as another presentation, really get into the discussion of benefits.
That was my question, so I can save it for them.
Wonderful. See, we know that benefits make a difference for employee satisfaction, for employee recruitment and retention. We've seen changes in the state benefit package. I think in addition to benefits, we have an employee satisfaction survey that goes out that can provide valuable feedback on some of maybe what the needs are that'll help us with recruitment and retention. And so just between the two, salaries, compensation, benefits, working conditions, it'd be great to see how all of this plays together. I know that's a bigger swath than we have time today, but I just wanted to get it in the record.
Absolutely. Thank you. Put it on the list.
Ms. Johnson-Hostler.
And maybe it's not quick, my apologies, and we certainly can add this to our actual finance committee after the third series. Why do we treat transportation, bus drivers and safety assistants differently, given we have a gap in need and pay for both of those?
Yeah, so I'll give the best answer I can. I think a lot of our graded positions predate to when I became heavily involved with HR. So our graded scale is based on, I think, two primary factors. One, the state has graded positions, so we have to align with those state graded positions. We also, I think, at one point had a compensation study that was done to help us classify these positions. So most of these classifications have remained sort of intact, I think, based on those two criteria throughout many years. And we've made some shifts to that where we see that that's appropriate, like DIAs, for example. And I don't know that I can explain to you clearly, Ms. Johnson-Husser, why the duties of a safety assistant, aren't paid as much as a bus driver. We do look at certifications, in fact, that bus drivers do need that CDL, and that kind of factors into it. But anytime we look at one employee group versus another employee group, I feel like we have a discussion of how much do we value employees. And that's a really challenging thing to talk about because we need all of our employees and we value all of our employees. It's just that some salaries are set differently and we continue to evaluate them to see.
That's what I was curious. I was actually more curious, was simply put, is it legislated, right? Like, are they separated legally or not? That's really the question.
Yeah, and we get, so from the state standpoint, we can pay folks within their own grades on the state scale, but we also have minimums and maximums within that state scale that we can pay employees. That's a big factor in it. All right, so quick process check. We are in 20% of the way through the topics, but 50% of the way through the slides, because really the main presentation here was on compensation, but we did want to take an opportunity to at least share some about vacancy reporting. I was in front of you a lot during the height of the pandemic updating on vacancy rates, and it's been a while, so while we were here talking about compensation, we also wanted to talk a little bit about vacancy and recruitment and some of those other things.
Dr. Mutillo, I think just looking at the way you have your slides set up, if we could do vacancy and then the next one being the hiring process, and then we'll do a time check there.
Sure.
Because I know at the beginning of this, Mr. Nieder said there are things that we can have at a different time to talk about this, but I think the vacancy rate is always something that we're concerned about, and I think since it's right in front of us, we need to talk about that and also what we're doing to fill it.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Sure. All right, so first slide here under the vacancy rate is, it's again a chart which I know you cannot read really well, but just wanted to point some things out. This, you can see a historical look at our vacancy rates from about January of last year through February of this year. I want you to note the yellow line. That is where you see our bus driver vacancies. Now, I want to point a couple things out here. Number one, we shifted the way we tracked bus driver vacancies. So you can see a pretty big spike in that June to July time period. Earlier on, we were tracking vacancies to see what we needed to fill our current level of service, knowing that transportation had already made adjustments away from what our optimal level of service was, just to make sure we were getting kids to and from school in a timely manner as possible. But then come July, we made the decision that we really should be tracking what will it take us to get to the optimal level of transportation service. How many more employees will we need? So that's where you see that large spike. Again, it's still high. It's still over 30% and increased, but I wanted to point that piece out on that line. Also on this graph, there is some positive news. You can see CNS and IA vacancies are down from the previous year. I also want to point out the bottom of the chart are the teacher vacancy rates. So you can see that our teacher vacancy rates have remained pretty steady around 2.4% to 3%, which means that 97% of our teaching positions are currently filled. That by no means signals that we don't have concerns with our teacher vacancies, because even one teaching vacancy persists longer, is harder to fill, and has some of the most dramatic impact on student achievement. So while the rates may seem small, having to find additional teachers in a smaller hiring pool is still a challenge. Also, so a lot of these lines are headed a bit in the right direction. So that's your vacancy rates. The next one shows it to you as totals, and this is where the teacher vacancies have flipped. You now see the teachers at the top of the chart just because they're our largest employee group. But what this does point out to us is that even with a low vacancy rate, we're talking needing 300 or almost 300 teachers. And that's a challenge that not a lot of other districts have to face. Being so large, we need to recruit a high volume of high quality teachers every year. So I think it is something that, while some of the smaller districts and low income districts receive special attention and differentiated funding, being large, we have our challenges too. They just may look different than other areas of the state. And having to find up to 300 teachers is certainly one of those challenges that is fairly unique to Wake and maybe a couple of the larger districts in the state. The next slide there it shows you vacancy rates and totals back to a year, as well as the month-to-month change. And you can see, mostly we've made, there have been decreases in those rates from year over year. You can see bus drivers at the plus 10%. And again, the way we track that is impacting that plus 10%. But also, again, not minimizing the fact that we do need additional bus drivers. And it's still a challenge that we're trying to tackle. And then this last chart shows the same data, but just in a graph form for you.
And I know there may be questions, but let's figure out what the hiring practices are before we get to the full part. I feel like that it's one slide. Is that okay?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I thought it'd be helpful just to kind of lay out how hiring actually happens at the district level, because it's not the same across every district. But in Wake, we base it on Board Policy 7100. All positions have to be posted for 5 days. The hiring process officially begins once the job is posted and schools request a posting. And then once that position is posted, applicants create or apply to that position through completing an application in AppleTrack, which is our current applicant tracking system. And they'll provide experience and references, performance evaluations in the case of teachers, transcripts, licensure information as applicable. And then the next step involves screening and interviewing by the hiring manager, which is generally done at the school or within the department. All of our hiring is school-based as well as central-based. And then once those sort of recommendations are made, they have a candidate at the school or at the county, at a department within central services. They will send those recommendations to human resources, and we will review the application, determine eligibility, do the background check. I think in previous presentations, we've talked about sort of auditing and financial checks and balances, but this is a way that there's a checks and balance for staffing as well, where the school will do the initial work, do the initial review of the application and references, but HR provides that additional review to ensure that the person is qualified and we're bringing the best candidate we can into the system. And then after everything checks out, if it is one of those positions on a graded band, we do the salary offer, or we just confirm for the employee where their place is on the salary schedule. We notify them that they are being recommended for hire, and then also look at, that's when they then would go to orientation, and eventually we would submit the recommendation to you as the board. And any time a school or even us in central services, we use the word hire, we don't really mean it, because you all are the only ones who really hire employees. Everything else is a recommendation to you. And even when we approve conditionally teachers so that we can get them in classrooms prior to putting them on the board lists that we bring, that is a conditional approval. And their letter will say that this is conditioned upon board approval of this hire. So I just want to make sure everybody understands that point. And then that sort of completes the hiring process there.
Thank you. I know we started a little late and had a lot of great questions, and I look forward to hearing more about recruitment and new teacher support at a later date, and I want to thank you for bringing your team. But final questions. I know Dr. Ng had his hand up. I see Mr. Hershey and Ms. Waters. So let's get those questions on these last two pieces. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of the vacancies, has there been some analysis of vacancies by areas or schools that to kind of look at the trends and where the needs are greatest and or reason why certain areas are having more vacancies than others?
Yeah, we do look at vacancies by area and school, and they are different throughout the county. I mean, we have a number of schools that don't have any vacancies, and then other schools who may have more, so that it is something that we've looked at. I think some of that can be regional, geographical, sort of the outer reaches of our county. Some of it can be for other, varying reasons based on, previous success of the school and those kind of things that make, sort of might incentivize somebody to take a position. But there definitely, we do see some differentials in those vacancy rates.
Thank you. Mr. Hershey and then Ms. Waters.
One request of data is, can you get the average vacancy rates for the 5 years prior to the pandemic for these different, I don't want them now, but there's just I don't have a reference of what the bus driver rate was prior, historically.
Yeah, I don't know that we're going to be able to get that. Oracle doesn't allow us to go back in time in that way. We track this monthly, the first day of every month, and it's part of what Darren does. We can certainly look at what we have historically and pull together, but I don't want to overpromise that we can provide this level of data back from several years prior.
I will say, if you do a search back in Assembly, sometimes for keywords, you can find some of that, how many positions we had. I don't know if it's in a line graph like this, but you can kind of look at it that way. So, and if I find anything, I'll share it out. But I think it's important to see that trend.
And Mr. Hershey, we'll definitely pull together what we can.
As it relates to the bus drivers, is it because of the competition with the Amazons of the world that we are having higher vacancies, aside from workplace conditions? But I mean, just the compensation for drivers in general versus private industry?
I would say it's likely multifaceted, and I just will remind everyone, our challenge in recruiting and retaining bus drivers is not unique to Wake County.
Right.
It's not unique to North Carolina. It's a national matter. Pay is one thing, and competition. Working conditions is another big one. And support. I think of a bus driver as they have 6 hats or more hats on all at the same time. First and foremost, they're responsible for safely transporting up to 72 students. As I believe Mr. Swanson pointed out, with the safety assistance, the bus drivers too are the first person that student sees in the morning, and the greeter, and that first impression, the last impression at the end of the day. But they're also, to the extent that they have to on the bus, responsible for student discipline. Granted, any decisions about further discipline, but more control of student behavior on the bus. They're a custodian, cleaning up after students, or any accidents that may take place on the bus. So they're wearing a lot of different hats. There are different things we have been looking at over the last several years while we've had our challenge, including how we can better support them through the school administration and the school, because the school administration really has to own any discipline issues with the student. And there are trade-offs there as well, because if you suspend a student from transportation services, while that might be wholly appropriate based on the behavior a student exhibited, that also might keep that student out of school. So a lot of challenges.
And the final question, very quick. And maybe this is even for the superintendent, has there ever been a period where we've had this kind of vacancy rate with bus drivers? Just over whatever period of time you want to.
Not to this extreme. Okay. We have, I'd say, we've had challenges in hiring bus drivers for over a decade. But in the last few years, and with the pandemic, it's become exponential.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ms. Waters?
Well, thank you again. Very helpful information. My questions focus on the hiring process, and I believe there was good discussion about it before, but as someone who in the past role spent a lot of time helping entry-level workers apply for positions, I always found the Apple Track a little difficult to use for those who didn't have a lot of tech savvy. So I believe there was at some point discussion about introducing a new platform that was maybe mobile friendly and would eliminate perhaps a barrier to actually completing the process. So is there any information that you can share about?
Yes, and I'm going to let Dr. Matilla do it, but I will just say that you're kind to say that AppleTrack may not be the best.
As they all laugh because I do.
So, yeah, we are currently in the implementation phase of the new applicant tracking system. And we got to the point, I don't know, about a month ago where we could implement now before this hiring season and it'd be okay. Or we can really take our time with the implementation and target the fall. So our target date for that new system is going to be sometime later in the fall, just to make sure that we implement the best system we can, we train folks, so that is coming. In the meantime, we are working with Frontline, who's AppleTrack's provider, to see what enhancements we can make. And there is always the option. We do have a computer set up in Human Resources where our receptionist can walk folks through the application process. That some folks will walk in, so we do have some support there as well.
And then just thinking about the volume of work that your team is now responsible for because of the vacancies and the need to recruit and the multiple touch points that Human Resources has with every employee, do you feel like you have enough staff? Is your staff strain pulled to be able to handle this influx of needing to do so much more work with the recruitment and maintenance? Just asking holistic in thoughts of looking over at your team, how are you managing the volume of work that you're now responsible for? Because Human Resources touches every employee, and sometimes there's not always recognition of how much work it goes into taking someone from throughout the hiring cycle.
So I'll just say, I'll answer on his behalf, so you know, I'd say this. He needs more staff. He does need more staff. We do work on identifying funds in different places to add a bit here or there, but those needs are not necessarily being met. They can all tell you that they do more. They're doing more in less time and more demands. I don't think that is just Human Resources. I think it's happening in a lot of divisions and departments. Staffing is an issue in lots of our divisions and departments. Our last audit, which was over 10 years ago, said we were too lean in all of our areas, and that we've not, made the kind of growth that we need to based on the sizes that we have and the complexity that we have. So some things take longer sometimes, some high volume periods. There are frustrations that are experienced in different areas based on how long something might take to get processed or move through the pipeline. It's why we need a new system. It's why we need more people. And it's why we need to rethink our structures and processes in general around hiring, which is another portion of this presentation. But they do need more people.
And then just a comment, as we think about hiring, there are a number of sort of untapped talent pools, and particularly individuals who have disabilities, which may range in a level. Some are physical and some are intellectual, but there are definitely pools of candidates who are not often considered. And with the disability community, there's a high rate of unemployment, but most accommodations that employers don't realize could be as little as $500. So just putting a plug in to make sure that we are tapping into maybe some of our hidden job markets as we look to fill positions and do the important work that you do. But I appreciate you, your team, and the heavy lift that you do to keep things going. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Waters. Mr. Haggerty.
Thank you. The good news that I take from this is that most positions do show progress toward reducing our vacancy rates. And I know that's something that a lot of sectors of the economy are not seeing. So I want to applaud you all on that work. I think that's great that we're making good progress and trying to get back up to that expected level of staffing. Obviously, the vacancy rate for bus drivers is very concerning. And my first question is, how does the vacancy rate translate to coverage of routes? Like if we see a 30%, 33% vacancy rate, what does that mean for our ability to cover the routes? And I know the transportation staff has worked very hard to reconfigure, to optimize, to kind of squeeze out every efficiency. But what does this mean, and what can parents expect for bus coverage until this is reduced?
I'll take an initial response to that. Mr. Strickland, who's over transportation and facilities and other areas, please add in. But certainly, if there's a vacancy, it's going to impact our capacity to look for students, speaking at the 500,000 foot level, on time. When there's a high vacancy rate, it's going to have that much more of an impact. And even if I'm going to add to it, even if we have a nominal or a normal vacancy rate, attendance also can impact the service levels of transportation. So it's really both the vacancy rate and attendance that we need to focus on. And that's the 500,000 foot level.
So, Mr. Haggett, David hit on it pretty well. We don't really make a correlation between that high number of vacancies and uncovered runs. We've been in this position for so long. We just continue to try and cover. Vacancies are a problem on a daily basis. Forget the vacancy rate of 32%. We still have call-outs every day, as we do in all areas of the district. But we are not covering as well as we want to, as we could, as we should. But I do believe we are being as efficient as we can be with the resources that we have.
Let me reframe it. A 33% vacancy rate does not mean a 33% lack of coverage or lack of routes. Is that correct?
But what it does mean is that we are constantly doing double and triple and quadruple runs, and that we're not getting students to school in a timely manner. So we are covering many of them, but we are having to do those double runs, and that creates its own set of problems.
I think I would just say that levels of service are impacted. Frustration is evident. It's real. And those levels of service and that frustration is going to continue until we make a substantial difference in what's happening with the vacancy rate that you see before you. We can't continue to adjust the number of routes down just because we have fewer drivers. That has an impact on service as well. So it is an issue.
I appreciate that, Superintendent Moore. I know we have a lot of families that are impacted by these. They are frustrated, and it's good to just be honest about the expectations that while these vacancy rates continue, that we will have situations where either because of attendance or because of open seats, no matter how much we constantly work to reconfigure it, we'll probably experience this through the end of this quarter, maybe through the end of the year. Is that accurate?
I absolutely through the end of the school year. It's given the amount of time it takes to bring in drivers, get a CDL, and get them fully ready to go. This will not be solved before the end of this year.
And I think another thing just for all of us at the table to be aware of, how one system we have impacts others. So there's a lot of policy decisions we make that are going to be affected by transportation, whether it's our magnet program, whether it's our bell schedules, which routes we can run. And so we see this as a resource issue. How do we provide the compensation or the benefits to adequately staff our bus routes, cover our bus routes, but we also have to look at, again, working conditions for drivers, what's either keeping people out of the position, but systematically, are there other things that we need to look at internally in terms of maybe less reliance on some bus routes, or how often we can offer a bus. It's a tough decision, but if we can't sustain, I'd rather be able to deliver what we promise rather than not be able to deliver what people are expecting and counting on.
And we've got folks at this table that know that feeling of getting that call at Ms. Caulfield.
So thank you for all this information. It's a lot. So it really does fill in a lot of blanks. And I appreciate the fact that you brought up it's not just as far as salary, it's also other things like taking into consideration discipline. And that kind of, along with what you said, our policies, our safety and security, our facilities, bus drivers, they're kind of, you want them to be able to look forward and pay attention to what's going on, but to have that behind there. So I do appreciate for the folks that are listening, I'm sure they appreciate that being added in, that it is, of course, they want, more pay, but the discipline is really, a concern, whether it's special ed, whether it's the teachers, whether it's, bus drivers. So, I think that's something that we can definitely need to focus on. It seems to keep coming back to the table. Thank you.
I think, thank you all as well for walking us through this as well. And I do understand how discipline does affect everything. But I think, the biggest piece is we got to get to the root cause of that. What is, and I've been saying this, it goes back to my experience as a classroom teacher, as, if a student's acting out, what is the cause of that? And we know there's many, many factors that goes into that. And, I think there's many factors. I think we do increase pay. Hopefully that would find ways to, not excuse certain things. But if you're getting compensated for what you feel that you deserve, then other factors may not necessarily be as alarming. But I do think it takes an entire approach. It takes a village, and I think that we can go outside the box and be resourceful to find ways to address these pieces. But I don't believe that we should over-punish students because they're young, they're going to make mistakes, but there has to be some learning to that, and I think that we can kind of figure those pieces out. So thank you all.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming, and I know we're going to continue this, and thanks to all of you for being the experts in the room and sharing this. I know you have a tough job, and we appreciate you being here to answer our questions today, and we look forward to seeing you again, whether that's at another work session or in finance. In brief consultation with the superintendent, since we're only bringing year-round and modified calendars, felt comfortable pushing that to when we look at traditional as well. So we'll move on to bell schedule recommendations and then move forward with our superintendent search process and timeline. And thank you to Ms. Anderson-Powell and Mr. Carrozza for being here and for your flexibility. So this is an intimidating looking document that's in front of you all.
More so we can't see it.
And hard to read, or impossible.
So, Ms. Mahaffey, Chairman Mahaffey, I am filling in for Mr. Snide-Miller today.
Welcome, Mr. Strickland.
Thank you so much. I have to say I was remiss. I did not get over in time to load that document that you're referring to onto the computer. It is difficult to read, but it is in Simply.
All right, thank you.
So for your consideration today, we're bringing you the 2023-24 Bell Schedule proposal. Per Board Policy 3300, Bell schedules for the subsequent year are approved by April 1st. We're recommending no changes at this time for Bell schedules for next year. I would note that Mr. Cook is here, and at a later point in time, we will be bringing some information to you all from academics to discuss and look at if a change in the elementary and high school bell times is something that we would consider for further years, not for the 23-24 school year. With that, I would just reiterate that Board Policy 3300 requires the board to establish a school day or bell schedule for the subsequent year by April 1st of each year, and staff recommends no changes at this time to that bell schedule for next year, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Strickland. And this is not on this. It will be the next board meeting that we approve this bell schedule. Are there any questions for Mr. Strickland at this time?
I will just also say that before we get started that, so we're not making any changes, we're not opening any new schools, so it remains the same, which is what we will ask you to approve at the next board meeting. And the reason you see Drew Cook sitting at the table is because we know that this is also part of a bigger discussion about bell schedules, and he'll provide a little bit more background on that and where we are with that in just a moment.
Ms. Johnson-House.
I hadn't gotten to Drew yet. But this question is not a question I think you can answer, but probably one for you and Facilities Chair, Vice Chair Haggerty, is based on your last comment, I do feel like, yes, we have this bell schedule. It stays the same, but I feel like it's a larger part of a conversation of, can we keep the bell schedule given our current bus driver issues if we're not going to actually make changes, which you put out several options, right? Can we manage the number of school options that we give each community? Do we have a priority that we have to start thinking about in terms of how we get kids to school or who we can't get to school? So this isn't about us changing this bell schedule. It's just publicly acknowledging. I don't know where else this conversation goes, but since you brought it up, and it's sort of facilities that I feel like we have to have a larger conversation.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson-Husser. And to that point, I mean, this was something I think we talked about when we were talking about, the potential changes of bell schedules that we will talk about later. But I know in the past there have been audits or consultants coming in to look at our processes and procedures. And my question is, I know that there's so much that goes into this in the day-to-day operations. And this is the will of the superintendent and our chief facilities officer, but is it possible to have somebody come in and do an audit of our practices because we're so focused here? Maybe there's a way that can be looking at things
I'm looking
from a
for
different
someone
lens. Okay, thank you. Because I just know when you're in it and it's there, it's hard to, I think we heard the term, think outside of the box so much the past few years that box is like smashed and like rolling down the hill. But I think maybe that could be helpful. And I know our bus drivers are limited to routing through TIMS. Can you talk about the TIMS system for a minute and the limitations of it?
TIMS is the system that is used by every school district in the state except for one. It is provided free of charge by the state. It used to be an archaic system. They have made some inroads in the last 8 to 10 years. There are other systems out there, but we would have to pay for them. As a part of taking a look at where we are and how we do things, we can certainly look at, would it benefit us to go to another system? Now, there is a cost associated with that, but if it provided better service, it is something that we should look at. I would note that, again, all districts in the state do use TIMS. Our staff is very fluent in it and have used it for a long time. So any change would likely require a steep learning curve. But we'll vet that as we go through the process.
Are there any questions for Mr. Cook or Mr. Strickland on the proposed bell schedule for this next school year? Dr. Ng?
Just an informational question. Just historically, has it always been like 7:20, 7:25 start time earliest, or is there a rule on how early it can start, or?
There's no rule on how early they can start. They can start earlier. I can't remember if we've had any that are earlier than what they currently are. I don't remember anything earlier than what we currently have. But part of the 3-tier system requires that you have enough time between the different tiers to get to the next tier. And one late delivery in the morning in first tier makes everything else second and third tier late. Same thing in the afternoon. So part of the, I think we may have moved the times earlier a few years ago than we had been, maybe from 7:30 to 7:20 or 7:25. They were moved earlier specifically to ensure that we have enough time between the tiers to get from one tier to the next tier for the same bus driver. We could go earlier if we wanted to, but I think that kind of goes in the opposite direction. That goes in the opposite direction of the work that we're seeing in terms of what we should be doing. So we've not made a move to go earlier, and instead we are having a bigger conversation about whether or not that's too early.
Well, I'm going to sound like a grandpa, but I just remember when I was young, I went to, wait at the bus stop. I went to school at 6:45, and so, yeah, it's,
We do have bus routes that begin shortly after 5 a.m. now.
Yes. They start very early.
So that would be another reason that we look very carefully.
Yeah.
Because, that has to do with how long our routes are, how many drivers we have, the existing infrastructure, transportation infrastructure in the whole county, and what that looks like in terms of, it used to take me 30 minutes to get from point A to point B, and it's now more like 45 to 50 minutes to get from point A to point B, and that's in a passenger vehicle, not a school bus making stops.
And I would just add, another implication of the double and triple and quadruple runs is that while the start time on the calendar says 7:25, in practice, often what that means from a supervision standpoint for a school is kids being dropped off at 6:40, 6:45, 6:50.
I literally was like, they are at school now.
Right, which places a premium on school staff to be present well before their workday starts in the dark to supervise kids to be dropped off the bus. So that's another, and that was discussed, if you'll recall, about a year ago when we considered briefly adding or starting 5 minutes early to capture 5 minutes of instructional time with which to use for early release days for this school year only. And we quickly, I think, decided to move away from that for all of these factors that we're talking about.
It's back to working conditions and other issues that we just talked about, right?
Yes, sir.
Vacancies, compensation. Pretty much. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you, and we look forward to voting on that next time. Appreciate it.
And we will, pending board direction and I think consultation with the superintendent, Ms. Waters, I think tentatively we're planning to bring back the larger, longer-term bell schedule conversation that our current board members will recall we last had back in September. So it'll be a little bit of review for them. It'll be new information for new board members. We'll have new data to share based on stakeholder feedback and input that was conducted in the fall. Data Research and Accountability has conducted that analysis, so we'll be sharing that likely at the Student Achievement Committee meeting in April, kind of get board direction and guidance on any potential next steps that would not happen any sooner if there are any changes in the 24-25 school year, which is why we wanted to keep that conversation separate from today's topic.
Thank you very, very much. Appreciate your flexibility as well. So sometimes you plan a work session and you think you can get through it all, and sometimes you have to make some adjustments. So I want to thank you all for being flexible. We did get a round of head nods about the North Carolina School Boards Association. Today, we will be voting on that contract, but right after that, we're going to be talking about the timeline, and we're going to be talking about the vacancy position and what will go out to advertise that vacancy. I have asked Sam Thorpe with the School Boards Association to kind of come back and see that discussion. You see in Sibley, there are different draft timelines. One is the initial one that we started with, where we heard the feedback was that we wanted to be more intentional. and then an updated one, and then I believe that there's going to be an additional.
Here's like a
Yeah.
model one we've used in the past.
Yeah. So looking at the one that we did with our last superintendent search. And so, Mr. Thorpe, if you want to come up, I think you have some hard copies of
Yes.
things for us, just so we're not staring at screens. And yeah, I don't know about everybody here, but sometimes seeing it on paper is a little bit easier for my elder millennial self.
So the timelines, yes, sir.
Okay.
Left side, okay.
Right.
No, excuse me.
Thank you.
And if you, yeah. All right. And if you hit the house button, there's been an additional one. I had a conversation with Mr. Blumberg. Welcome, Mr. Blumberg. And when I say hit the house button, that just means refreshing the page. You should see an additional timeline, and that was just to kind of compress things and allow for a little more flexibility, getting rid of that May date that was just kind of standing on its own and just compressing it for the board reviews application piece. So what I want to do right now is have everybody take some additional time to look at those timelines, including the new one that's loaded that Ms. Allen is graciously putting up on the board, and I believe that's listed as version 2 on Simply. Yes.
There's a hard copy.
The hard copy is, yes, also there. So the difference is when you look at
The application deadline is the 17th instead of
yes,
the
the
14th.
application deadline being the 17th, and then the other change that we made was 1, 2, 3, down on April 28th. We just expanded that to be April 28th to May 2nd to allow for flexibility of meeting on those applications, to choose the first round interviews, and to discuss questions. Sam?
Can we ask questions right away based on
We can
this?
talk about what we prefer,
Okay.
questions. We
My-
try to keep things flexible. This is just,
So based on when you, the 2017, 2018 draft on here, there were almost 2 months from advertising to the application deadline, and here we're doing 40 days or so. And I'm wondering, and that's with a nice Christmas break and all that stuff. I'm wondering why condensed from that timeline, or from that one and now this one.
We've always done historically somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks. This is just a couple of days shy of 6 weeks. It's 2 days shy of 6 weeks. But I did that more because of the interest in moving quickly. Most boards that we're working with, I would say all boards actually that we're currently working with, want to move as quickly as possible. So we're happy to advertise for 8 weeks or even longer if that's something you're interested in. I think it won't compromise your pool at all to advertise for 6 weeks as opposed to 8. But
I think the other thing we wanted to be cognizant of was the our current superintendent's end date. And then also knowing once we get past June 30th, July, you have 4th of July holiday, so we would be doing interviews, right, if you're starting from the end and we're working backwards. Some folks may not be available for final interviews in July, and wanting to be cognizant of the end of the academic year for folks that are currently superintendents. Mr. Swanson, Ms. Waters, Mr. Haggerty.
Oh, I didn't have a question.
Oh, you didn't? I'm sorry.
It was just a Fisher's question, but I'll,
Oh, sorry, I thought you had your hand up.
no, it was,
My bad.
well, since I do have. I
Since you
guess,
have the floor.
I would love to say if we could do a 6 weeks. I just, I've already said I think the timeline is very rushed. And I just want to ensure that we're giving, that we're going slow so we're not in this boat a couple of years. But I do have a question, Sam. That was my concern. Based on what happened in 2018, that's pulled
is it safe to assume that with everything that's happening with the pandemic and whatnot, that the applicants that we saw in 2018, that large pool, may shrink based on just what we're seeing nationwide with education?
We're seeing smaller pools. It's impossible for me to predict what your pool would look like, but I can say that it's down in all the searches we're doing here in North Carolina, and that's true of the searches we're not doing, and it's also true nationwide. I don't know that extending it longer will necessarily generate more applicants, but it is your search, it is your time. I'm perfectly happy to extend it.
Thank you. I have another question. I'll
Yes,
just get
go
back
ahead.
in the queue. I'm done tonight.
Okay. Ms. Waters?
To that end, just anecdotally, if you don't have hard facts, do you find that most applicants apply very quickly upon the opening of the job posting, or do you find kind of a trickle throughout? Because sometimes people know a job is coming and they're just waiting for it to post. So do you have any anecdotal data around or information around if people go ahead and apply quickly, or do you see applications come all the way to the midnight hour of the close? Because that kind of helps, I think, frame the perspective I have about how long the application should stay.
The vast majority of applicants submit the application, finalize it, and submit it, in which case you can't touch it anymore, unless they ask us for permission to, very, very close to or on the actual application deadline, sort of within 24 to 72 hours of that application deadline. Now, what most applicants do in talking to applicants and working with them, and we can watch when someone logs in and begins an application, and we track that really closely, is folks are generally doing a deep dive on the district. They're looking at your board meetings and looking at your minutes. They're looking at your facts and figures. They're going and looking at the report card and all that data at DPI. And they're beginning to formulate answers to the questions, getting their transcripts together and all of that stuff. Different candidates are in different pools in terms of their preparedness for submitting an application. But I think folks are spending that time researching the district, seeing if it's the right fit, perfecting that application and that resume, and then waiting until the very end. That's my experience. Do we get some that submit, within a week or two of it posting? Yes, but it's very rare.
Thank you. So, again, Jonathan has assured me that I can participate in the discussion so long as we're talking about process and not about the actual selection of a vendor, so I appreciate that. I wasn't able to participate in the last discussion, but I was able to go back and view it as a public record, and I've been giving this issue a lot of thought, and I've talked to other school board members in other districts, because we are not the only district out there that is looking to hire a superintendent. And there's pros or cons with the timeline, and we'll just have to decide what our tolerance of risk is. If you rush, the risk is you do not have time to adequately review all potential candidates, and maybe you've missed something in your vetting process, and that's a real risk. But the other risk is with delay, that if you delay, you miss out on very attractive competitive candidates who are going to take the first guaranteed offer that they get. And so it really is about managing your risk and what you're worried about. I see this as, at least here locally in North Carolina, I know we have a very similarly sized district that is looking for a superintendent and will probably draw from a very similar pool that we have. And it sounds like it's a very small pool. That part I didn't know. So, do we want to be the team that misses out on the best free agent, looking for the best deal, and then have to go to our second or third choices? That's the risk of delay. The risk of rush is that we miss something. There's something, I don't know that we'll miss an applicant, but we miss something in the review. Is there something that maybe someone interviewed really well, but we didn't ask the right questions? Or is there some procedural thing that perhaps we missed? So I'm hopeful that we can address both of these. But I do have a fear that if we miss out and we make our selection after other districts have made their selection, we might be getting our second or third choice of the candidates that are out there. So to address the concerns about missing out on the front end, I think we need to look at maybe those earlier steps and make sure that we get that review that I think is very important and a very legitimate point.
I think if I could, I'm not married to this timeline, but I just want to share a couple of things. We tried to keep that back end similar to what we have seen and what other districts have done based on conversations so that we have that time. We did move from, and I know it's only a few days, from the 14th to the 17th, not just to allow that application period to extend, but we heard extensively about the want for community feedback, for that survey, for getting out into the community, and we as a board will have to determine what that looks like, because that has to be driven by the people sitting at this table, with the exception of the superintendent and Mr. Blumberg, about getting out into the community. It's not going to be our staff that does that work. It's going to have to be us. And Mr. Thorpe will be able to help us and help facilitate some of that, but we have to drive those pieces with those communities that we know that we want to touch. So it was allowing for a little more on that end while being understanding of the back end, and really there's some flexibility because we did move things out of when graduation is, but for anyone who's been at graduation, you kind of live at the convention center. And so there's not much time for anything else, so we wanted to be respectful of that. So I know there are more questions, so I just wanted to kind of address where we came at with this, and like I said, this is a draft. Sam?
I have two things. One thing that I'm just want to push back a little on is if somebody is jumping at a first job, I don't know that I really want them, so to speak. Like, if someone is passionate about wanting to be a Wake County superintendent, they will wait, is what I think. But, I mean, I don't know. But actually, I have a question for our
There are different
superintendent.
theories on that one.
The time length of the application process for you, how do you feel? I mean, you were here, so was it long enough? Was it too long? I mean, what was for filling out the application, talking to family, that sort of stuff? Have you had any feedback on that?
I think people work differently in terms of how they approach an application process. Mine was, I'm very deliberative, so mine was in spits and spurts, right? So I can't tell you, I must have saved it 25 times to the School Board Association website because I kept going back in and reviewing what I had said, updating, checking my grammar, that sort of thing. But I think some people are geared to work through it in one sitting. I don't think you can do it in one sitting when you take a look at it. And some answers lend themselves to shorter answers than others. I think it just takes a while to do it. Sitting superintendents and anybody in the education field is going to have to carve time out to do it. It's going to be added on top of whatever else it is they're doing. So it is, and how much time are you giving right now? So is it April 17th is what I saw, or something like that?
Like, not quite 6 weeks. Is this time of year conducive to a superintendent having more time, or does that not really?
There's no thing.
She's the only one that.
It's better than June.
Better than May.
Yeah, better than May or June. So, but I think the time constraints get worse the further you go out. I think, and I mean, I'm not going to offer any other thoughts, but
No, it really helps. It helps a
It's
lot.
like, no, don't leave me out of this.
I think that's really helpful. It's time intensive.
I mean, the other piece that we tried to be respectful of in looking at the timeline is spring break for, I'm sure people have plans for their kids for traditional calendar spring break for those of us that have kids on it. So I'm just going to be open and transparent and say that part was there. Ms. Edmonds.
Several things, thank you. So this is a draft, but we do want, it is on the action agenda tonight, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so
I will say Mr. Thorpe is very quick at making any changes.
you answered one of the questions I came prepared with, which was I do want to get out in the community. I want it, rather than having one public comment event, whether it's here or some other location, I think it is our responsibility to go out into the community. So my question is, it was about staff, about whether or not any staff would be involved at all, and if we could do it in pairs or threes.
So that
Rather than Lynn Edmonds having her own town hall to hear from constituents, if we could do it regionally in pairs or threes.
I think, that is up to the 9 of us and how we want to see it. And the reason, I say not having Wake County Public School staff involved is because the feedback that you get from the folks, people are pretty explicit with that feedback sometimes. And you see that in the survey as well. And so we also have to, when we frame it, make sure that we're not making someone feel like because if they didn't come to an input session, their input isn't as valid or valued as someone who filled out the survey.
No, yeah.
But I also, that's a conversation that we have to have, and it's also a conversation that I wonder, is that something that precludes approval of the timeline, or we can have after approval of the timeline?
No, it does not.
And so, but I think it is a conversation we need to have.
Other than the fact that if anybody else is interested in doing such a thing, we have to, in my mind, that has to be done by April 11th.
Yeah. So that's my follow-up. My vote does impact the timeline. I agree with Ms. Edmonds. You didn't call on me, sorry, Chair.
No, go ahead.
So the compressed timeline for me is the entire thing, but especially the top of it. I mean, I think those of us who want public input have been very clear at this table about this. I also don't know that that's something that we can rush. There are only 2 people at this table who know anything about what the search looks like, and I don't feel like it would be personally ethical for me to be like, yes, Lynn, let's go have a town hall, and we've not discussed what each person is going to do, how we ensure that every community has the exact same access and information. So there is also some work that, Monica's opinion, that we have to do internally, 9 of us, to ensure that communities are getting the exact same access and information. So sorry, Ms. Edmonds, to squeeze in. The timeline, I don't know how we do that. I mean, we're at March 8th, pretty much.
Oh, yeah. No, that was a concern for me because I really want to do that. And like you, that was my biggest about this timeline, was that piece of it. And if I could just clarify for anybody in the room, including staff, when I was thinking about staff in my mind coming to such an event, I was thinking more of like capturing what is said. But I hear you. Maybe we can get our BAC members involved to take minutes or something to help us capture what is said. So that's it for me. Thank you.
So I'm going to ask a quick question. The April 17th date, and I'm just going to go with thumbs up and thumbs down. I'm going to go with, if you do a thumbs down, you'd like to see it pushed back a bit, and if you have a thumbs up, you're good. So let's just go around the room and do that. And I want you to be honest. And if you're not sure, put it in the middle. But that's the thing I want, because we're hearing that we might need more time for feedback on the front end, and that's the hard date that we have if we have an application deadline.
Can I ask a clarification?
Yeah.
So to Ms. Johnson-Hostler's point, and perhaps Mr. Swanson's point, do you see the value in being time before the application deadline or after the application deadline in terms of reviewing the applicants? Where would you rather
So that's
have
funny.
more
So I
time?
was going to be a thumbs in the middle because I don't mind where we do it. It's just voting on this particular timeline to me is saying we will get this done. So to your point, I was in the middle. I was like, I'm just saying that I feel like we have to, Monica has to give myself more time to be able to get this done in community and do it well. And so personally for me, we can get the applications on April 17th and still be doing our community input. But it changes the timeline because if we're not done, April 11th is when we technically get together to hear what we've all heard around the community. So it impacts the timeline in that way. But yes, I wouldn't mind if the application deadline is fine for me. I don't think it
That
impacts
is
when we
my
do the
exact
time.
thought. It's how does that April 11th piece?
Yes.
I'm going to take another approach.
Yeah.
Since Vice Chair mentioned it, I think personally, technically, if we go by this, March 8th is technically today. So that means how are we going to ensure that we're getting out in the community through these 21 days? I just don't think that's enough due diligence. To ensure that every voice across the district that wants to be invited to the conversation has an opportunity. I'm thinking about those families who, you know, it's just, we've got to do our due diligence. I just think that the top part for me does affect the April 11th, because if we're saying March 8th through the 29th, we're going to do all this community piece, and we haven't even discussed what the community outreach looks like, it's no way in, and it just seems to me that the April 11th will be rushed.
We're saying we don't think we can get it done by April 11th.
Yes, no, I'm just saying that as well. And so, yeah.
So I guess what I'd like to know then is where do you see where do you see the most impact from the community involvement? Do you see it on the front end? And I guess that because would we change the application based on input, or where would that come in? And is getting that community input, like, does that affect the application deadline, or does that community input affect kind of like how we rank and view priorities as we review applicants?
Can I make a proposal? Sorry, go ahead and answer, and then I have.
Well, I can only speak for my ones, just for me as District 9.
Yeah.
It would affect how I would go through and assess candidates, because if I don't have all the input from all of the district,
Right.
I can't go into this process. My information would be a little skewed because I'm going based on my own personal pieces without hearing from the constituents. So for me, I am open to pushing, if we had a concrete plan of what that community feedback looks like, I would be okay with this April 17th deadline. Since we don't, and since we're still trying to figure out what community input looks like across the district, that 17th for me, I'm going to give it a thumbs down, because I just don't feel like I can go into this
So
with a clear piece.
let me say this. We can continue to get community feedback because the application is separate, right? The community feedback informs who we choose to interview, and it informs potentially the questions that we're asking during the first round of interviews. That being said, we have a board meeting on the 24th of April. We can make it so we don't see the materials available to the board until after we hear the community feedback, because I think the community feedback is important. So can we flex, if we look at April 24th, and this is going to have some mental calendars, right? April 24th is our meeting. If that is when we get the feedback, I know that's not much additional time, and I'm just asking this, then we would just need to flex the review of applications, but that's the 21st to the 28th. How much
We would make
time?
the application materials available to you, so we could wait to make the application materials available to you.
Till
the
after we
24th
get-
Or till the 25th even.
Right.
And that way you haven't even sat down to review them until you reviewed publicly all of the input and had a chance to discuss all of the input that you
Right. And so that would then, we could still review those applications. We've got flex days between the April 28th and May 2nd on needing to push those, and we can push that back as well. Is that giving more time that you feel is appropriate? Or do we need to, or are you feeling like we need to push back even farther to the end date?
I have a question that might
Yeah.
answer.
Go ahead,
some of that
Cheryl.
question anyway. That's kind of where things start to shift a little bit. So if we do wait until April 24th, there's on the initial one, it says April 24th, so there's like 0 days there, but for that meeting of applications, right? But if you go to the second draft, it says April 28th to May 2nd. So why is there 4 days on one and 0 days on the other?
Some boards meet on applications, and it's one meeting and only lasts a day. You know, other boards want to build in more time to discuss the applicants. So I think there wanted to be there was some desire for flexibility.
And that's a range, I want to be clear, that's a range of days. You're not expected to be there every single one of those days, but seeing as this is a draft timeline, I just wanted to make sure we were giving more accurate ranges than saying absolutely on this date, because I don't know what everybody's calendar looks like.
So,
Oh, sorry, Dr.
Go
A
ahead.
has been waiting patiently. Thank you, sorry.
I look at this timeline, and it's not one flow after another after another. I look at it as parallel. I mean, you know, it's we're looking in terms of getting an applicant. I feel like yes, maybe giving an extra weekend for them to complete it and giving them the April 17th deadline is good, because I'm looking at, like, you know, Good Friday and Easter is the weekend before that. So maybe some people may not be able to finish it in time and give them the extra weekend to complete. But I think gathering the input from the community, I think that could be just an independently looked at deadline for us. So that it kind of alleviates some of the pressure on ourselves. And then, you know, like you guys were saying, present that information, you know, have that up until the April 28th so that we can be informed opinions from the community to help us with the decisions. Does that make sense?
it does, and that's, I guess, a question that I have. We have an application deadline, but we're not changing the application in this process, are we?
No.
So the application, it seems to me, and tell me if I'm misunderstanding it, that all of the community input, that impacts our deliberation. It doesn't do anything to expand or restrict our pool of candidates. Is that correct?
Yeah, so to be clear, I think Lynn and I both are saying, I'm fine with April 17th being the date. I'm questioning moving down the actual community access and information info.
What I'm wondering is trying to balance.
Them doing that is not going to be...
Trying to balance not going too long or perhaps missing candidates with getting the community input. What I wonder, and tell me if I missed something because I wasn't in the last meeting, you know, we can continue to have the community input from all of these days, 8th through 9th, all the way up until the point that, you know, the board is reviewing applications. So why move the deadline from the 14th to the 17th? Why not keep that deadline when it is?
I think that was just to add the extra weekend.
Yeah, I agree with Dr.
Time.
for the weekend.
Okay, to try to get them in. I just, you know, I was looking at a way that we could try to build in more time for those input sessions before we began our deliberations. So
we're on the same page with that. So
Okay.
what we're looking at is that piece above where it says April, I scratched it out. Optional meeting to review community and staff input and to draft custom leadership profile. So changing that date, which then would allow for more time with the community input. The date that I suggested for that was April 24th, which is our last board meeting in April. Now, we can have a special called board meeting if we feel like we need more time than that.
But like, would you rather have the 28th and have 4 more days to potentially reach out to the community?
We can, that's what I'm asking. So what do we think?
I'm open to it, but this one works.
So it's 28th?
We do want to have a little bit of time to be able to review all that, right?
And develop a profile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So would we want to review that before we then hop to the board review applications?
So we would need to be done with all of the feedback probably at least 4 days before we see the feedback. What's your turnaround time for getting that profile?
So on the surveys, depending on how many comments you get, that's why I built in, 10 or 11 days to try to redact all the comments, all the confidential personnel and student information.
Okay.
The forum piece is different to the extent it's unclear exactly how you're going to get that feedback and how you want that summarized, but I don't think that would require too much.
More than the 10 days?
So if we moved that to the 24th instead of April 11th, when would we then stop, complete the review of reading all the community comments and then move on to the application? Right, because didn't you say it's better to review all that first and then move on to see who actually fits, right?
So we would have to look at the community comments and the applications concurrently. And you'll see everything summarized in the School Board Association profile and reflection of that. But the comments are the things that are going to take more time because there's pages of them. Ms. Waters, did you have?
I don't want to, my question is unrelated, so if people have more related comments, I can hold back my question.
Ms. Johnson-Hustler?
It's a clarification from what you said to what's written here, so to clarify. So the option you have here, Mr. Thorpe, is that we meet to review community and staff input, i.e. online surveys, and to draft the custom leadership profile, which you also included the special comments. So I guess I'm reading this to say all feedback is reviewed to draft this profile. The feedback are not separate. Mm-hmm. So all feedback. And I think what I heard you say is we could do the survey with the applications. I don't think that's what you're proposing.
John?
I just wanted to speak to that, just to pause for a second and see if that's where you guys are on it. I understand the parallel ideas of the applications coming in and while you're continuing to get feedback. There is a fair question, though, about whether you should, before you look at any application and are influenced by any particular candidate, should you first have taken in all the community input and build your profile? So you have your
That's
profile.
the question I'm asking.
Right, that's the question, and so I just ask that as you look at this, there's some leeway here on parallel, but do you want to sort of have a hard point that we're still going to get the profiles done before the applicants are shared with the board, that you develop your profile first before you look at individuals? And I think that's a fair question.
But I guess I'm asking, that's the proposal.
So
to clarify,
I need some time to generate our survey summary report and presentation and redact the comments. Although we shared the unredacted comments as soon as we get them. As soon as we have those and have formatted them, PDF them, and posted them in Assembly, we share them with you so that you can begin reading those. Same thing with the survey summary report. But for me to generate our presentation, I need a little bit of lead time, depending on what sort of feedback and how I'm summarizing it in this community input BAC piece. That's a little bit different. I can obviously figure out what you're looking for and maybe hit some themes, look at some summaries that we've done in the past. But I don't think I need a ton of lead time to do that. But I couldn't do it up until the 24th, or really even probably up until the 20th. I think I would need about a week, maybe a little bit more.
So
to summarize it.
What did you mean by redacted?
In the survey samples that you have, there's a free response section at the end, uncapped free response section that allows survey respondents to discuss anything that's important.
My kid's teacher, Jane Doe.
My daughter's
blah,
name
blah.
is.
And so when it's released to the public, because it's personnel, those are all blocked out. So you can still see the rest of the comment, you just cannot see any names.
So the public will see the surveys?
The public will see the surveys, the public will see the comments. The only thing is if, let's say, Kathy Moore applies to be our superintendent and it says Kathy Moore, they won't see her name.
Okay. So you edit out any...
All survey
confidence.
respondents remain anonymous. Just want to make
That's the
say
key.
that for everyone that's watching or hears about this.
Please do to the survey.
Survey respondents remain anonymous to us. NCSBA is never going to know who filled it out. You're never going to know. No one is ever going to know. However, to the extent they provide comments, they are subject to public record, absent confidential personnel or personal identifying.
So it'll still be there. You will just cross out, so to speak, the private information.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to clarify that.
Sure.
So, Dr. Ng.
So you had mentioned about having them on April 24th
Yes,
to go over.
which would mean we would need to be done if we're giving an NCSBA a week, the 17th. What we have the ability to do is have a special called board meeting if we feel like we need more time. So it doesn't have to be the 24th. That's just at our next. Right,
But if we wanted the 28th or something.
right. But if we want to build in more time, and let's say the 20th is when we want the feedback period to end, then we could do something on the 27th.
In your all's experience, did you just need the one day for choosing first round interviewees in this case?
It might have been 2 days. I think it was 2 days.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just looking at that week of activities, April 24th week, to see what other things are going on.
It's all going to be busy, and the closer we get to the end of the year, the busier it's just going to be, and that's the nature of school years. Ms. Waters?
Speaking as an individual board member, I just have concerns about the advertising beginning tomorrow based on sort of the draft of the posting that I've seen in comparison to that similarly sized district and what they have in their posting. I feel it's more robust and more reflective of attracting a stronger candidate. And so for me, there doesn't seem to have been enough time for discussion on the actual posting that will go out to the public, which for me is the introduction to the candidate pool for what we're looking for, what we expect. And in comparison to that other large district, I just see a more attractive, more robust, more heartfelt introduction to the community for what we're looking for someone who is student-centered, who is able to come in and build up our staff, who's able to connect with our community, who can work with the board. And so to start it tomorrow with the posting that currently exists, for me, creates some angst. So as an individual person.
I just pulled up Charlotte. That was my second issue.
This is the conversation that we need to be having. In anyone's review of that, do you have suggestions? Do you have ways that you would like it to change, to be phrased? I do want to come back to the timeline because we're either approving the contract and not approving the timeline tonight, and then either waiting 2 weeks or having a special called board meeting for this. So, we have to look at a couple of things. If we're looking at the posting, as folks were looking at it and saw things that they didn't like, what were the things that you suggested changes? Because this is our vacancy that we are drafting. This is the template, but also the longer that we make it, the less people are going to read it.
For a job like this.
They're going to read the whole thing.
Right.
Yeah.
All right.
They're going to want to know. I guess for me, this is putting our best foot forward. Vice Chair Haggerty has already said, we are literally in the throes of competing with the second largest district. We can't ignore that.
That's right. No, I agree.
This is not competing on the Thomasville.
I agree.
So
that's just me.
That means that our entire timeline changes. So we're not starting tomorrow.
Well, sorry. Go ahead.
Yep.
No, go ahead.
Tyler?
Oh, no, I've said quite a bit. I want to make sure my other colleagues have some.
So, I mean, the first thing on the timeline is, of course, the decision I can't
Right.
take part in,
Yeah.
which is who we hire. So we can't do anything until we hire somebody. But once someone is hired,
Whoever that may be.
whoever that might be, you know, I think we can give in the timeline the grace period to get the application in the shape that we want so that it is reflective of the district and the importance and the specialness of this job. Another thing I will offer in terms of scheduling that had come up, next week we have a facilities meeting scheduled that doesn't have a full agenda. So if we needed to come back to review something on the 15th, we could take 45 minutes to an hour, I believe, out of that meeting. Mark, tell me if I'm speaking out of turn, but remember we were going to try to reserve about an hour of that meeting for just new business and public discussion. If we put that off, and if that still works with the schedule we have, you think we could get, and we could extend it beyond 5 p.m. too.
So I would ask, you know, I mean, I don't know that the facilities committee, well, I appreciate that is the.
No, it would
where
be
we
a
would
called
house it.
meeting.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, if this is time that members had already blocked out, we could have another meeting without disrupting your schedule, time off work, or anything that you might have done to kind of balance that day.
I'm out of town that day.
Damn it.
So I literally was like, yes, this works for me.
I'm not going to be available.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is the, like, I understand, and with you on that question, Harry. Could there be a potential special meeting? Do we have to wait until next week? Can we call one?
Jonathan, what are the rules for calling a special meeting?
48 hours notice to call a special meeting.
Which would be the evening of the 9th or Friday the 10th.
Well, follow up to that, please.
Yes.
What about the 14th? Because we do have.
I'm out of town from the 11th to the 15th.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
I can get somebody to cover, but I'm out Friday.
My kids are tracked out, so we're just gone and
So
literally until the 15th.
If we need 48 hours, and I
Yes.
think that can give us a little time to marinate, could we call a special meeting 48 hours from today, if that's conducive with folks?
I cannot do Thursday.
Does that work for, does Friday work for, does Friday not work for anybody?
I'd have to get somebody to cover for me.
Jonathan would have to get somebody to cover. Does Friday not work for anybody?
Only our commission with the meeting with, do we have the virtual meeting with
Well,
the
this is
commissioners?
We do. I know. We just did.
I could do afternoon. I
That's
can't do mornings.
Afternoon.
Yeah, if we even needed
What
to step
time is
out.
our, right? No.
How different is the description or application from now between last time?
Pretty similar.
Is it drastically
remember.
different?
It's very similar.
Yeah.
But it sounds like there's some specific feedback like Ms. Waters and some others might have because it is, significant time has passed, new challenges have emerged with our new strategic plan. We might have other things we want to emphasize. So the ability, again, we can't provide that to a vendor until we have a vendor, right? So having a few days could help us put that in there.
So we have a potential for a work session at 2 p.m. on Friday. That still does not answer, that would be, we'd have to do all of this in a work session. We would also need to have, yes, Jonathan?
You can call it a special meeting, and it can have action items. So if you want to approve the advertising and the schedule, you can do it. It doesn't have to be a work session in that sense. So you can, as long as you post it as to review and potentially take action on the timeline and the advertisement, you can do that.
We can approve, yes. I think that was.
If this meeting that we're trying to do is just to expand on the application part, am I understanding that correctly?
And review the vacancy, so folks can have time to look and wordsmith things and changes that they would like. What I'm hearing is there is more than a quorum of board members that would like to see some changes made to the vacancy application.
The listing.
Yes, listing.
And I think that we would only have to push the application date back a week, and that should not really impact
Okay.
much of everything. I mean, if we're pushing back the the advertising, now we're condensing it closer to 5 weeks. And I think that it should not be that condensed.
I agree.
Okay.
So you would review the timeline then as well?
Yeah.
On
Yes.
Friday, as well as the vacancy announcement and the application?
And if we're having the meeting and we're bringing everyone back, would we be able to have something, I'm going to look at the two of you, to be able to share for everybody else, sort of like how we would structure community outreach
We
in
can
meetings?
make that a part of the agenda. Absolutely.
And I did have one point on that, as long as it's coming up, that, if one board member or informally one board member asks another board member to come to a town hall or whatever, then that's not a meeting of the board. But if the board sort of decides, and it's perfectly fine, that we're going to have these town hall meetings and all board members are invited to them and it's part of the structure of the search, then those are public meetings, which is fine. It's just they need to be posted and there would need to be some minutes maintained of it. And that may be the best way to go on those anyway.
I suggested it that way in pairs, not anything to not make it a public meeting. Obviously, it would be, but more because of our challenging schedules, trying to get all 9 of us in the same place.
And you can absolutely do that, and it still be a public meeting that we're essentially having almost like a panel. Like, 2 board members will be there, but we'll post it. It's a public meeting to receive information. You can't take any action because there's not like a quorum, but you wouldn't be. You're just receiving information. And then the key on that, as you already know, is to make sure all that is captured so that the full board has it all.
All right.
Yep.
So we will be meeting again at 2:30 on Friday to discuss this. That means we have tomorrow, Thursday, and part of the day on Friday to share what changes we would like to see how we would like things to be structured, and to be able to share that. So if you have changes that you want to see to the vacancy, please come with something written down to share. With the timeline, I will try to take some of your feedback, but if you have suggestions, please email me, and I will work with Mr. Thorpe to try to get it done. And we'll see, even if we have different options, and we can choose between A, B, and C, or I like A here, but I like B there, so that we can come to consensus on this and make sure that we are all feeling good about what this process looks like going forward. And I am looking forward to having this discussion and continuing this discussion on Friday. Is there any further questions, comments, concerns? Ms. Edmonds.
I just want to confirm I've got 3 agenda items basically for Friday, which is the job listing, the timeline, and then the input, how the input sessions would look. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Is it the application too, or no?
No.
The application. I just want to know if feedback on the application.
I might be using
just the posting
Posting,
is
so-
my understanding.
Okay,
I did
got
not
it.
hear any questions on what the application questions are, and as discussed last time, what you want is you want to ask those questions with the people that you interview, not add to the application. The other piece that we will be talking about is the advertising piece and where we want to advertise, so make sure you review that and know what you would like to see, or if you're good with all the free stuff, and we can ask for a broader explanation of what all of these things are if a Google search doesn't work out, because some of them are pretty, some of them are listservs and some of them are pretty specialized based on the profession, so you may not have access to the full piece of it. Mr. Swanson, did you have more?
I just had a clarifying question. So we will not be voting, well, there's nothing to vote on now tonight's agenda.
The only thing is the contract,
Right.
so
So we'll
that we can, yes, but we will then, on Friday, we'll have this discussion, we'll get everything sorted out, because, an hour was not enough time.
No, it wasn't.
And that's okay.
I did not feel comfortable rushing this conversation with that. And so.
And that's why we're doing this, but I'm really glad and grateful that everybody is free at 2:30 on Friday, so that we can.
2:30, okay.
2:30 on Friday.
2:30, okay.
Yes, sir.
And I just wanted to clarify from Mr. Ford, what's the time that you need to collate, you got all the information? You say a week is enough?
I will do my absolute best.
Maybe for 10 days.
Okay.
We'll figure it out as we're going through the timeline. I'll make sure that I'm not getting squeezed. The other thing you may want to take a look at, to the extent you want to change it, are the surveys. It sounds like the more particular feedback you want to do through forums or through some other medium. And you want to keep the surveys like the application as they've been presented to you. I just wanted to mention that in case you wanted to look at them in the meantime. But it sounds like you want to do your more particularized, specialized feedback via forums, maybe some other public comment medium.
We didn't get into that part, but maybe we'll hear something different on Friday. But it will give folks something to think about over the next couple of days. Ms. Caulfield, you had your
I just
hand up.
wanted to be clear, because when Lynn said it, I thought we were covering 3 different, well, not 3 different, just one of them. So you want us to be prepared to look at the advertised piece, right?
Yep.
We are going to do the application sequence 17, but that's not shifting what we're.
So we haven't approved the timeline yet.
Okay.
So right now, I'm not hearing that we're going to be shifting that. But again, I don't know what we're going to see on Friday. But I didn't hear a strong push to push that date back. So again, we're going to discuss the timeline. We are going to look at the vacancy profile and what the vacancy profile is going to look like. So what's going to be going out in those advertisements. We're going to be looking at the advertising options and what we would like to see. We are also going to be discussing what we want these community forums to look like. And if you will all look at your calendars and try to think of, not that we have an idea of what they're going to look like yet, but I think we all have a bit of an idea in our head, dates that are available. And then the other piece is just making sure you go over the survey piece, the staff and the community sample survey, just to make sure you're good with that. There are questions we can add, but really, I will say the biggest thing where you get the most value is from those narrative comments at the end. Are there any further questions? I know this is a big lift for the next 2 days, but I appreciate you all.
That's great.
All right. Thank you. I'll see you in the other room.